Welcome to the Board of Education meeting here. We have an important topic to discuss tonight, and looking forward to the discussion. A lot of work has gone into this topic, and we hope to bring about a conclusion here this evening. So this is the special Board of Education meeting, an open session for the purpose of discussing the Isthmus Montessori Academy Charter School contract, and we'll be focusing on issues of the ongoing negotiations, which were three areas basically: the attendance area, 3-year accountability plan, and the employee handbook waivers. I want to make sure that everyone remember that that's what's noticed for this meeting, so try to hold everyone into a strict account to stand within those subject areas. And so what we'll do here this evening is we'll take the three topics one by one, and at the end of those discussion of those three topics, we'll have some final comments and move to the vote. So that's the way I like to handle it here this evening. We do have 15 minutes of public comments, and 15 minutes is what we'll have. And so do have the timer here, and we'll get started with public comments. And so our first speaker today, and I'll take these as they were given to me, is Michele Durant, and Michele will be followed by Brian Potts. You have 3 minutes, and you're on the clock.
Thank you. My name is Michele Durant, and I've been a teacher for over 20 years with MMSD, and I also represent the North Side on the county board. I am not against Montessori, however, I am against this contract. We need to focus on the schools we already have and invest in those schools we already have. Instead, we're considering buying an expensive charter school that will only help a small number of students. This proposal, when at max, would offer enrollment to 20 students per grade level. If our goal is to offer Montessori practices to our kids, then let's do that. Let's offer Montessori within our existing school buildings. Incorporating Montessori could be done with much less expense, and it would become more available to a larger number of children. The staffing plan with this contract is inadequate. There's not enough support for children with special needs. There's not enough support for English language learners. With the contract, there will not be teachers that are specialized in teaching art, music, or Phi-Ed. MMSD custodians are not part of this proposal. Will parents clean the building? As a teacher, this is not the kind of parent and community engagement that my students need. Will teachers and SEAs have cleaning duty in addition to recess duty? Will there be training on how to properly clean the school in order to avoid health and safety hazards? I know that the folks from AFSCME, who I've been working with for decades, are professionals.
This will not add up. Approving this contract will take millions of dollars away from our existing schools, and that is not addressing the achievement gap. As policymakers in local government, we are called upon to make difficult decisions. It is possible that this contract proposal could move to the local charter czar. But when is the time to stand up for what is right? When do we take a strong stand for all of our children? I'm tired of accepting something bad in fear of something worse. If you truly represent all students and all families, you will vote no on this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Brian Potts, followed by Tim Rogers.
Hi, I'm Brian Potts. I'm an attorney at Perkins Coie in Madison. So I don't have any particular personal dog in this fight. My daughter goes to Shorewood. I hadn't actually heard of the Montessori school until a few months ago when a friend referred IMA as a possible pro bono client. So in association with an associate in my office, we agreed to represent IMA and help them negotiate the contract. I've never been to a school board meeting before. I'm not a specialist in school law. So, but I do serve on the other MMSD, the Madison Sewer Commission. So I know how hard your all's jobs can be. And I thought, what would I want to know if I was you? And the answer is, from my perspective, I have spent a lot of time now with Melissa and Carrie, who obviously you guys probably even know better than I do. And I can't say enough good things about them as people. I think they will do an excellent job. I think they probably have done an excellent job. Melissa's not here because because she just had her baby. But I just wanted to get up here and tell you that, at least from my personal perspective, I feel entirely comfortable with them as educators, just from knowing them. And the other thing is, I wanted to thank Kelly and Dylan for doing an absolutely excellent job with this contract. It's, you know, there's a lot of, it's not an easy contract to write, and frankly, we didn't have to make that many edits. So that's all I wanted to say today.
Thank you. Tim Rogers, followed by Paul Caruti.
Hello all, Tim Rogers. I'm speaking as a delegate for the South Central Federation of Labor and ASME Local 60 as a representative and employee. We are opposed to the IMA contract without having professional custodians. We do ask that you only approve this charter if you have us custodians, Local 60, working there as well, because it's for the safety of staff, students, and the public when they come into the building. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Paul Caruti, followed by Fabian McMurray.
I did not sign it.
You did not want to speak?
No.
Okay. Fabian McMurray.
Or just decline to speak.
Decline to speak also? Okay. Rob Larson. Okay. Emmett St. Jacques.
Hello, my name is Hermes Jacque, and I'm a parent of a Montessori child at Lloyd Barbie Montessori in Milwaukee, and I'm also part of the Montessori Task Force and in support of ISMA School. First of all, I want to say this is my second meeting here, and the first time I was actually just shocked at the number of African American students who feel uncomfortable in your district based on your report that was given at the last board meeting that I attended. And I couldn't believe that we had an ISMA's parent talking about the trauma her child experienced, that her child did not want to go to school, and when she enrolled her in ISMA's, she couldn't believe the turnaround and how her child was empowered and wanting to go to school, desiring to go to school. And I just see that juxtaposition of the number of kids, Black, African-American kids who said they are uncomfortable. And here's a mother testifying, giving witness to the transformation, okay? And there were several things that came up. Diversity, okay? And I was also shocked when I looked and saw the parents from ISMAS who embodied diversity. You know, towards the end of that meeting, when the parents left, the diversity went out the door, okay? They came, various people, representing different cultures, ethnic groups, whatever. And so thinking about diversity, ISMAS represents, embodies diversity. Another issue that was raised was arts, okay, music. I think people who raise some of those curriculum questions are not familiar with the Montessori program. As a Montessori parent, I thank God that I have a basement, because I don't have to decide what pictures to keep, what artwork to keep. I just put them all in the basement. I'm like, I'll deal with that years from now, okay, when we move, or when she is old enough to decide what she wants to keep or not, okay? If I had time, I would share the songs that my daughter sings to us, okay? And just the rhythm that she has and the beats and all these. I mean, she has this creative song about cornbread, and I won't even get into that. And so just thinking about my daughter's development and flourishing in a Montessori program, okay? In terms of art, in terms of music, etc., okay? And all I want to say is, thinking about the number of African American students who are uncomfortable, okay, here, all right? Give Montessori a chance.
Thank you. Mark Johnson.
Thank you. I'm Mark Johnson. I'm a 35-year veteran of Milwaukee Public Schools, Milwaukee Public Schools Teachers Union, and I also was part of the founding of one of the Montessori schools in Milwaukee that is kind of, most of our Montessori schools in Milwaukee are regular public Montessori school, regular public schools. The one I founded was a contract school, and so we did not, our employees were, teachers were not contract, or were not part of the union. But interestingly enough, it was because even though we asked, the union wouldn't have us because their contract was so restrictive. So strangely, I was part of the union, still am, because there was one teacher assigned to the school by MPS, that was myself. But my thought here is that those very real and important concerns that were addressed by union members are definitely concerns that we all have to pay attention to and address. But my request would be that we look to a proven model that can bring a lot to our public schools and to the union itself, and ask the union to kind of embrace the effort rather than well, whatever. The other issue is that it's very, very difficult to take pieces of Montessori and inject them into schools, although best practices, you know, do find schools using a lot of it. The opportunity that we're looking at here that we had in Milwaukee was to bring something that tends to be only for wealthier private citizens and give it a life within the public school system, and be part of the public school system as opposed to be in a countervailing force of some sort. But we've found tremendous support from our families. It's brought great life to the Milwaukee public school system, Montessori has, and it's just one of the many, many opportunities that our children and families have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Paul Nefstatler? No speak? Okay, then that concludes our public speakers for this evening. Okay, as I stated to start the meeting, I'd like to just take the three areas in order, but I think before we do that, I'll wait till you guys get ready. So, Madam Superintendent or Dylan?
I like that, Madam Superintendent.
Either one of you guys like to start off? That's my 35 years of Toastmaster experience.
Is that it? I'm not going to say much. I just want to remind the board that at our last meeting, you charged us with going back to negotiations with three very specific issues to bring back to the table. I want to thank Dylan as well for her hard work on this, for Kelly's assistance throughout the process, as well as Mike's, and just remind the board that since the board approved the Montessori school back in January, we've been working hard with ISMAS to initially address the contingencies that we laid out, and then since then to work on creating a contract that's aligned with the charter that was approved. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. And I'll go ahead and pass over to Dylan to walk you through the final contract with a specific focus on those three areas.
So I'll just briefly give an overview of the three areas of change. That is where we focused, where the board's direction was from our meeting 2 weeks ago now. The three areas we primarily looked at was the admission criteria, attendance area, transportation area, student demographics. That's section 9 primarily of the contract. And what we have incorporated for your consideration tonight includes a substantially more limited attendance area than that was previously provided. If you'll recall, the version brought to you 2 weeks ago had the entire district as the attendance area. Explained that was an effort to balance student demographics with enrollment and maintaining enrollment, and the feedback from the board was that they were not satisfied with that, and I think that was fair feedback. So in looking at the concerns raised by the board, we offer you Exhibit A, which is the proposed attendance area that is slightly geographically bigger than the attendance area that was in the proposal. Because that was really taking a look at the demographics. We heard the feedback. What are you doing to ensure that the school serves those students who you say you intend to serve? How are we going to reflect that in every aspect, including how you draw your attendance area? Because DPI has told us that attendance area is an eligibility criteria. It's a yes or a no. So how are you going to live that? In drawing that attendance area, we still had that hanging question of transportation. That was a concern raised by the board throughout the entire process. How are the students who need transportation the most going to be given the transportation? And so that is Exhibit B. That is the proposed transportation area for the school. It is smaller than the attendance area, given the budget constraints of transporting through a large attendance area. And it's slightly altered from our previous transportation area to weigh into those very questions of, did you really look at the students who were in your original attendance area and really weigh out who's in and who's out? Should a student from one neighborhood not be transported while someone else is? And so we did a pressure test and added that as Exhibit B. So James, I don't know if you want me to pause or to go through all the changes and then we'll go through. I just want to do it how you want me to.
Why don't you go ahead and finish all your changes, and then we'll discuss it though based on those areas.
Perfect, thank you. The second area that and in that area then, because we defined the attendance area, the references to internal transfer and open enrollment were removed because the attendance area then becomes an eligibility criteria. So when things were added, other things were taken out, and I just don't want to gloss over those. The next area we were asked to focus on were the handbook waivers. And there were two things we were asked to do, right? Meet and confer with MTI and really take a look and a pressure test of those waivers. And I think we did both of those. We met with MTI and went through that entire section. Carrie and Melissa from IMA were there. Myself and Deirdre and Heidi were there. It was a great session. It was a session of a lot of question and answer and give and take. And one of the suggestions that came out of that, which I think was very helpful, was the FAQ document. Because it's hard to explain the why, right? It's hard to ground yourself in the why of anything in a contract. Contract language does not lend it to explanation. So I thought that FAQ was at least helpful to explain the why. The section looks much more rewritten than it is. One of the things I learned from that meeting was I had not written the waivers with clarity. And while I was asking for waivers, it wasn't a clear explanation of what was intended to fill the void. So we tried to find that balance, not only a blanket waiver, but how is that waiver going to be used so that it's not, we waive the 25 hours so it can be 100 hours, but we waive the 25 hours knowing that it's up to 30 hours, right? So to draw the limit on that, and that was helpful. The newest waiver in there, or a new waiver, is the school calendar. And that was really born out of this. As we sat down, looked at the waivers, really set that upper end, we learned that the Montessori model was creating a longer work day. So looking at that kind of, if we're asking you to work more in a day, that calendar waiver means, but there will be fewer days in a year, right? So how do we create that balance and fairness within the model? Yeah, and so that's how that, and then the FAQ is in there. And really the bottom line is, if you look at the FAQ, the model, right? Why are we asking for that waiver? The pedagogical model of Montessori requires X because of Y. We also really wanted to intentionally clarify any misunderstandings regarding licensure versus certification. And one of those things is I realized I was using certification to mean DPI licensure, but that is not certainly how anybody else heard it. So I wanted to clarify that the expectation is that teachers hold the DPI issued Montessori license. So that was kind of expressed in the arts, phy-ed, and music portion of it, and also in the FAQ, just to clarify. The third area that we were asked to look at was that 3-year renewal, and this has kind of been an evolving part of it, because section 26 was actually added due to initial feedback, but then we got some feedback that, hey, I don't know if that has enough teeth, because what if we are missing the marks? And what if we can't be confident that we are going to right the ship? Do we have to wait 5 years? Right? And that's just some learning we've taken from how we have helped our current charter schools. And so the language I added gives the board the capacity after that 3-year review that had been built in to, with 30 days written notice, order this up for a special meeting. And really, we can do two things. We can go above the administration's kind of directives and support to have a remedial plan, right? And it says the board can actually enter in and be more prescriptive as to what they think they need, not what they think, what they need to see in order to kind of write that course over the next 2 years. Or they can vote to close IMA at the end of the then current school year. I did add then current school year because I just don't think any of us, closing a school in November would be very, very difficult. And I don't think a position we want to be in. So it's trying to be both very practical while really taking the directions of the board and trying to give it the teeth you asked for. So those were the 3 areas. There is a change to the budget. That budget change has to do with just kind of going back and re-looking at the numbers and re-looking at the policy. As we were just looking, because we had policy 10,000 in between our last meeting and this meeting, so we were deeply diving into the charter policy and looking at what the policy says for the pupil transfer amount. So you'll see that there is a change because the state open enrollment transfer amount for special ed students changed, and so the IMA budget was changed to reflect that. That funding change is then reflected in their special ed staffing decisions. And the rationale from IMA was, if these are dollars that were intended to be for special education, then they should go back in supporting special education students. So those are the changes.
All right, thank you. So again, we're going to take the discussion in order here. We're going to just deal with the attendance area first. So, Nikki?
Actually, can I ask a procedural question first? As there was a budgetary change regarding special ed formula, are we allowed to also address that because it did change?
The special ed formula, sure. We can talk about that particular formula. Yeah.
Okay, and as for the admissions area, then I screwed that up with the transportation zone, so
Say that again.
I thought you said transportation zone.
That's part of
They're kind of all together.
Then I will ask it, why is Kennedy Heights again not transportation area? According to number B, it says it's not in it.
Lindbergh was not included. Lindbergh as a school attendance area was not included in the plan that the board approved in January. And that was after discussions and planning with IMA.
Kennedy.
You said Kennedy Heights. Kennedy Heights is a complex within Lindbergh. Okay, so
Yeah.
yeah, so Kennedy Heights is within Lindbergh school zone.
And also Kennedy School is also not included, correct?
Okay, so Kennedy school, sorry, Kennedy school zone is
Under
included in the attendance area. It is not included in the transportation zone, and that is because Kennedy reaches so far to the east, and we were trying to take a zone of which we thought we could essentially afford. And so all the decisions regarding the transportation versus the attendance zone was based on the transportation cost analysis. Sorry.
And what, are there any major intersections that would need to be crossed if we need it? Like Peppers Avenue, I know it's not an issue, but other avenues?
We wouldn't assume that Kennedy was a walking zone.
But it's. All right, TJ.
Just a quick clarification on the admissions criteria and the attendance area. The preferences that add up to 10% are outside, or can include people outside the attendance area.
The only one is Founders.
Okay, so the staff one doesn't, the sibling one doesn't. What is that? Am I missing one?
Those are the three with the 10%.
So Founders,
too.
yes. Staff, no. Siblings, no.
Right.
Okay.
No, siblings.
Siblings.
No, you're right. So the
I
I just
asked.
want to make sure I'm saying it correctly. So the admissions criteria is to either live in the attendance area, which is the bigger area, right? Or could be an and/or, but or be the child of a founder.
Okay. And then so the staff exception only covers staff who live within the attendance area.
Staff preference covers
I guess
staff.
that would
yes.
be, and then there is also, isn't there also
Governance
a
council.
governing council which would also only cover?
Governance council members that reside within the attendance area.
Okay, just in
Yeah.
I didn't know that, and now I do. Thank you.
Just a follow-up. What is the clarification between the founders and the governing council? Since
Founders is set in stone. It is those 7 members set out in the contract. You can't, I mean, unless we were to amend.
we did add them, so I'm just trying to figure out.
So a founder is someone who did substantial amount of work on the initial proposal. Badger Rock has a list of founders. Nuestro Mundo had a list of founders. We did not do a ton of, well, how much, like we didn't say did they do 50 hours or 45 hours, but it was people, we've actually met with all of them as part of different committees, but that was the definition of a founder. So someone who did a substantial amount of work on the initial proposal to make the school from a proposal to a reality. Whereas governance council members, that is a moving group, right? So founders is set in the contract, that is what it is. You don't have founders part deux, right? Governance council members can go on and off because you could be on the governance council 1 year and be eligible for the preference, but if your stint ends and then you have a child, you would not get a governance council preference after you're off the governance council.
So my follow-up question would to be with this. So you're talking the founders, the governance council, and the current staff, their children cannot exceed 10%.
So that was one of the questions, which I learned we were the first one to ask DPI this, was is that 10% annual or cumulative, right? So if we had 150 kiddos school and we had 11 of our 10% in, do we have 6 spots for the next year? Or do we still have, what was my initial number? 115 spots, right? It is not cumulative because they said that in the next year, they're no longer getting the founder's preference, they're getting the continuing student preference. So it is not cumulative, but an annual percentage cutoff.
And then I would imagine, let's say someone might 1 year join the governance council, get that preference, maybe get in, and then maybe have another child, but then they would,
create
the
a
second
sibling
child would be
preference.
able to go under sibling preference, would be outside of the 10% cap.
Yes.
Okay.
Because the sibling preference and the continuing student preference are those statutorily required preferences. And so, yes, those would, yes.
Got it.
Okay, Nick.
Quick question again. I wasn't here in the January votes, please bear with me, but how did we go from 2 founders to 7 founders if we can't change them? In the January.
So I think you're misunderstanding that we can't change them. There was nothing to change them from until we have the contract. But my point is, it's not, council members change as the council.
Okay, that's what I wanted to make sure.
Once they are set, unless we affirmatively amend, but they aren't like this iterative that every year it could be different. That is a set group.
Okay, that's
Does
what
that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
I'm sorry if I was unclear.
My one other question, I just want to be clear in the contract, because on page 8, it says under 8, the means by which the school will achieve blah, 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 right? The first paragraph says, enrollment in IMACS is open to all students in the MMSD or those applying under the state of Wisconsin's open enrollment program.
That is a miss on my part, Anna.
Great, thank you.
No, I appreciate that. That is, I really was trying to focus on the 3 sections I was
No
told
problem.
to,
No,
so that's a miss on my part.
Okay, thanks.
First, a quick clarification. Anna said the current staff, and this would be the staff at the time of when it's a charter school, not the staff of the private school.
Right.
And
There is no
so-
current staff for IMACS.
Okay, that's what I wanted to check that. And then the second thing is that I understand your answer that as this contract is written, that this is that there can be new, that people can rotate in and out of the governance council and therefore get this and rotate as employees and get this and then become siblings or else continuing students and things like that. Is that something that is hard, fast DPI / Wisconsin law, or is that something that is a choice that's being made in this contract?
Siblings and continuing students is a shall. So shall be preferenced.
Okay.
The other 3 are a may.
So we could put, if we wanted to, we could say that governing council members up to a total of 6 families over the course of 5 years or something like that. We could put that in the contract and that wouldn't violate anything with DPI.
It is a discretionary preference.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
what I'm asking is so there would be ways to, if there is a concern about these accumulating, and they could very well accumulate, that there would be tools that could be employed. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay,
That was actually really clear. Thank you, TJ.
Any other attendance area
Thank you.
Any other attendance area questions?
Just one last clarification, and just I'm thinking of our last meeting, and there is that section of the contract that says every year the board can revisit the attendance zone. So if we learn that there's some sort of issue, at least the things that are discretionary,
And
that can be adjusted.
as a practical matter, and I think there were some conversations, it is easier to expand your attendance area than constrict your attendance area because of how those preferences for continuing students. So I want to be transparent with that and not say we could amend it anyway, because if we were to say all of a sudden we're going to have a much smaller attendance area, that would be more difficult to navigate versus a larger attendance area.
Okay, any other questions?
Just to clarify, so you're saying it would be better to start with a smaller attendance area and then change it to become bigger?
So that was
if
not
necessary?
weighted in any way to make any judgment. It was actually just a statement of fact that if you started with 1 house and then expanded to 10, that is just easier to navigate than trying to go from 10 houses that can get in to then only 1.
Right, Mary?
Can you remind me, Dylan, why the Lindbergh attendance area was excluded?
Kevin might be better equipped to answer this question, if that's all right, Mary.
Sorry, Mary, that was the question I was accidentally answering for Nikki because I misunderstood. So Lindbergh is a very small attendance area as it is, and with its current enrollment rates, we have built into the long-range kind of facility planning process within our teams just further discussion on what the right next steps are for Lindbergh. And at this point, we didn't think that this was necessarily the right step for Lindbergh, and that was in much conversation with ISMIS along the way, along with our senior leadership team and board members along the way leading into January.
Other attendance area questions? Okay, then let's move on to 3-year accountability.
Waivers are first in the contract if we want to just.
So,
sorry.
waivers, that's on the employee handbook.
Yeah.
You like to do that first, that's fine, as long as we keep them separate. So we'll do employee handbook waivers. Go ahead, Nikki.
As an attorney, I'm worried about the issue of precedents. What kind of precedents are we creating if we're allowing for longer school day, more classes, different schedule? Are we creating a precedent where we need to follow this at other schools? Or is
No.
this a one-time
This
deal?
is, so.
Basically, is this Bush v. Gore, or is this, it shall never be used again, or if we should?
I don't know that it is that far on the continuum either way. I think what it demonstrates is it's an iterative process, that there are ways to have an exception to a rule, and the exceptions don't always eat the rule. It's what you choose to do with the exception. We have been as transparent as possible. We've set upwards caps. So we've had, even when we were in the area of collective bargaining, we had exceptions to the collective bargaining agreement as MOAs, right? And the MOAs didn't void until Act 10 came along, when they expressly voided a contract. But the MOA never jeopardized the contract proper. It existed for the very purpose of recognizing the contract proper and then recognizing the exception. I am very careful to use that language because we are not collective bargaining. We are prohibited from collective bargaining. But what we're trying to do is understand the best interest of all of our employees and future employees, because right now we have no IMACS employees. And so I think the answer is no. And quite frankly, the board is the gatekeeper for that in many ways, because the handbook is a board-adopted vehicle and tool that is conferenced with our union partners.
I appreciate the work that was done. I appreciate the improvements, and clearly the language that's in there now is better, and I'm glad that, and the FAQ is very useful, and glad that that opportunity was created and that was done. Couple kind of pulling back from that a little bit. One is just is a detail matter, but the exclusion from involuntary transfer is only applied to teachers. And I think that's problematic, given the different school day and different working conditions that are there. So EAs would not have and BRTs, well, BRTs would BRSs, I'm not sure, would not be excluded from involuntary transfer, and I think that that's problematic. Beyond that, you mentioned the MOUs and how, if we were to do something like this under the days of collective bargaining, these waivers would have to be incorporated in an MOU. Mm-hmm. We can't do MOUs anymore. We have a handbook, and under collective bargaining, the contract was clearly the collective bargaining agreement was superior to the charter school contract. Understood. What I see in the language and how this was done is that the contract is superior to the handbook, and that what I would have liked was that we go closer to the model of the MOU and to say that these are the waivers. The Board of Education has agreed to seek these waivers through the handbook process, and they will, and we will do that, and that they would then be addendums to the handbook in something resembling MOU or MOAs, because right now this is a different precedent than the one that Nikki raised. But the precedent for me is that, and I said this before, the handbook process is a very fragile thing. That this says that the contract takes precedent over the handbook. And, I'm glad that we've done better, but that still is a precedent that I don't like. And I don't think it's and I don't think it's one that's necessary. I think that if the contract language had been to say that the Board of Education will seek these waivers through the handbook process, I think that would have been sufficient for all involved, and I think we would have gotten them. Well, 99% sure we would have gotten them, right? Or we'll seek to incorporate these waivers into the handbook through our established process. And so I think it's a precedent, and I don't think it's a necessary precedent. I don't think it's the only way to get to where we got to. So that's just kind of my comments on the waivers. That again, I thank everyone involved for sitting down and working out and creating these improvements. I think it's a lot better place than we were, whatever Monday ago that was. But it's still a little uncomfortable.
I'll accept that as a comment and a feedback because it's hard to respond to at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, TJ. I think you kind of laid out a plan for us going forward as how we can do this cleaner and quicker and without a whole lot of so much more back and forth that and maybe even a little late in the game, oh yeah, you better go back and change this. Now we can say, wait, up front you got to do it this way, and that will be helpful. There were a lot of things about this whole process, in particular that the handbook brought up, where we going forward, I think we have a better roadmap here on how to do this. And there's another. Let me ask this now, but it might be a contract question we can address later. But in an email earlier today, Kelly, you stated that the custodial issue hasn't really been resolved yet, although there's nothing in it in the budget. It's zero in the budget for it, but that's still something that we have to negotiate or we have to discuss.
So I think, right, I think in some leases the cleaning services and the everything is included, and that is kind of the current state, so that is reflective of the price of the lease in the budget. If we were to do something else, I would be hopeful that the savings would be coming somewhere from the lease. But the lease is not fully, right? It's this chicken and this egg to get the lease negotiated. You had seen a draft of like the IMA Inc., and that would be an exhibit, so eventually you'll have that contract to also approve. But
is that where?
Yes,
that's
where we would
Is that
address
where the
custodial.
issue remains unresolved then?
Yes.
In the contract we're talking about leasing the actual building.
Yes.
Yeah, that's where
A portion of the building, subletting essentially a portion of the actual
and if
building.
we decide we want our own people working there, that's going to impact budget, and we have to deal with that.
It likely could, but right now, it should also impact the price of the lease. So who knows if it's a net neutral, right? If we're paying for a cleaned building versus we're paying for a building that we clean, those might be two different prices.
And we don't have that lease yet
We do not have that
to
lease
look
yet.
at,
And leases do come to the board.
and that'll come to us. Okay.
And we have examples of both types of leases in our district. Cleaned space and uncleaned space. That's not a judgment on this space. You understand?
Yeah.
That was an oversimplification
Well,
and not
is it
intended
true
to
that if we
be
occupy
overly
more
correct.
than 50% of the square foot, then we send our custodians? Is that part of our policy? Can you refresh me on that?
It is not a policy with the capital P, and I can't speak to our practice on that.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a particular percentage rule. I mean, the examples that we point to are Nuestro Mundo, which we lease from Monona Grove, but it's our custodial staff that cleans it. Another example would be Badger Rock, which is leased, but we do not provide the custodial services. And there are a lot of other examples in between. We have commercial space on Gammon Road that we clean. We have the 4K sites that are owned by all sorts of other entities that we don't clean. Ultimately, it's going to come down to what makes the most sense. And yeah, I don't think that we're have an axe to grind on that one way or the other. If whatever the board ultimately decides, what we'll do.
Can I ask a procedural?
Well,
Hang on, Dean, you're done? Okay, go ahead.
If we have some union members here, if they happen to know, should we ask them possibly? Or would that be out of order?
That's out of order.
Okay, I did not know, but I just thought out of practicality.
Any other conversations or questions, comments on handbook waivers? All right, 3-year accountability. 3-year accountability.
All right.
Yep. Dean?
Well, I don't know if I've said this out loud, but in the 3-year time, the charter process is what we are living with here, and it's not my favorite. I don't love the process, and this whole proposal and the discussion around the policy stuff has made me think even more about our charter policy, and I have things that I want to think more on it and add and take a harder look at it. What I think I need to say is that we asked 3 years. My particular reason for doing it is if in 3 years, frankly, if it turns into the white school, that's not what we want. And I don't want to wait for 5 years to say, you know, and then we have some choices to make. We either do what one of our speakers said is what I would have preferred to see us do in the first place, was build this ourselves and do it like the Milwaukee model would have been so much simpler. There hasn't been one person that said that the Montessori academic model isn't something that they can't support. It's a legitimate concern that works, and it'd be nice to have this option for our families and students. So 3 years, I think, makes a lot of sense. That's why I appreciated that you're able to include that in here. And I think if, you know, even if the school is thriving, if the demographics aren't right, well, you know, that's not what we're you know, that's great, but then we need to figure out how to do something different with it. Either absorb it and put it somewhere else and make it ours, take the charter, make it a model, make it a program, make it an alternative, make it an innovative, whatever, but then it's, or we make a school out of it, of our own, and or buy the building where it's in, and then we can completely run everything in it. And I think going forward, as I mentioned before with TJ's comments about the handbook, having charter schools and buildings that we own is going to make this a whole lot easier for me to support going forward too. And with the looming problem of having to move Mr. Munro, and we're going to have to figure something out there. And I don't want to rent another property. I want to buy some that we have our models in. And you know, good programs need to be ours, and then we keep them that way. So thanks for the 3 years. Some of my thoughts, and I wanted to make sure I said some of them out loud.
Thank you, Dean. Yeah, Laura.
So it says that the student demographics should generally reflect the overall diversity of the district. Does that mean that, like, it's a subjective review, or is it an automatic, like, if the percentages don't match up, then it automatically resorts to one of these two, like, outcomes down at the bottom?
I think that's a fair question. My thought is it's not, okay, the district is, I'm just going to make up a number, 25% X, and you're at 22% X. That is not reflective, so we're shutting it down. But that would raise red flags, because the whole process is around meeting or not meeting expectations, and so figuring out how or why we got there, and going from there. So I don't think it is an automatic, and I want to caution, because I also don't want Dean to kind of oversell or me to not have fairly explained. None of this would trigger an automatic anything. other than a review. And so that may be enough to trigger the fails to meet expectations, which would trigger a deeper review. But there is nothing that locks the board into one thing or the other.
So is it us or that determines what fails to meet expectations then? So we have to decide that we do a review?
So the whole paragraph, the review is triggered by the application to renew. So if at the end of 3 years they say, hey, we think we're doing pretty good and we want to keep going, that is going to trigger the more deep review. Because if at 3 years we don't get a request to renew, that is a different conversation, because that is an indicator of something else. That is an indicator of not wishing to renew their contract. And so I don't know what that discussion looks like, and I don't want to get into it tonight. So that's what would trigger it. We have a rubric then that is tied to the renewal process. And so this whole thing is tied to that trigger of saying, we think we're doing great enough to get another 5 years. And we say, hey, let's take a deep look. Because then if you aren't meeting expectations at 3, we're not sure that you are doing enough to even finish the first 5 years. Does that make sense? It is a pretty negative view, and I don't want to paint it that negatively, so that is worst case scenario. But that's really what the language is.
But we also can take a look at 1 year. I mean, 3
Yes.
years of review, but we can take a look annually.
We're expected to look annually
So
also.
I think we need to keep that in mind.
Yes.
Nikki?
Actually, I think Anna, were you first or?
Oh,
Is that okay,
you guys mutually agreed, that's fine with me?
Okay. My question was around that review. So if year 3, we'd be looking at the data at year 3, let's say it's not favorable, then would that be the time then if we would move to close the school, that would have to be done before the start of school year 4?
Personally, I think probably practically it would close at the end of year 4.
Okay.
Just given the amount of time and process, I think just as a practical, if there was a significant for cause violation of the clause, that would probably be something very different, like a material breach of the contract. But I think for practical matters, it would probably be 4 years.
Okay.
Just because we're tied to that 3 years worth of data. We have done annual reviews. And remember, as James pointed out, there is an annual review of data. There is an annual review of attendance area. And built into the for cause are material breaches of the contract. So there are also like there are wayward points set in also annually. And some of it was trying to find the balance of just the lift of that level of work and that level of review. Because the other thing, even in our renewal cycle, was trying to break this perpetual renewal work. Because then schools aren't actually focusing on running a school, they're focusing on renewing their contract. And it's trying to find that right balance of doing the work and demonstrating the work.
Nikki, then Mary?
Excuse me, sorry. Allergies. How is not meeting expectations, can we make that as a material breach? Because technically they have violated the terms of the contract in a way that they failed to, for our students, reach their goals academically. Is there a way to do that?
To what? I'm just wondering what is trying to be accomplished. Is it to speed it up and close it at
Correct.
3?
At the worst case, I'm talking worst case scenario. And I looked at some of the case law on that, and it stated that if you're not performing, and I believe it's Goodyear, but don't quote me on it because I could be wrong. But it said if you're not performing, then you're allowed to stop, make sure that they can have a period to cure, and if they can't cure, then they have the right to cancel the contract without penalty. Is it that type of situation, or is it we're just going to review with no teeth? I'm sorry if that sounded way esoteric.
I'm just trying to find the right answer, because I feel like it's still embedded in that annual review, and that annual review is what's building in kind of the right to cure also.
Okay.
but I also think we have to balance like the practicalities of shutting down a school with X number of students who are ready to go right, it's just striking that right balance and finding what the practical implications and outcome are going to be. You know, I tried to build in a notice period in there so that there is a fair notice period, and try to create all of those kind of contractual things, Nikki, that are like contract based, but I also tried to come up with a very practical solution to the issue that I heard raised.
Yeah, so on that point, it would seem that if it was with regards to students achieving objectives with regards to their performance, that it would be very difficult to get the data until basically the end of year 3, unless you are basing it on just 2 years, the first 2 years of data. So based on student performance, I think it would be difficult to do. However, based on student demographics, you could do that. You will know the third Friday in September, and therefore you could. What is the notice period that you built in?
For the 3, it's 30 days written notice.
So
that the board wants to take it up versus the administrative process that was worked in.
So if at the end of September we don't see the demographics that are reflecting the school district, would we be able to make the third year the last year?
I'm going to pull up the language and just look at it. Sorry. So currently it is linked to the filing of the notice of the intent to seek renewal, right? So that's how which is then set to the timeline above, which would be June 30th of their third year. So then you would have, so
I think that's that wouldn't allow us then to be able to, right, because you obviously need students and families to know
earlier,
January at the latest, right? So I would be looking for some type of ability to terminate without having the notice of renewal, maybe by December 31st. That gives you time for the third Friday enrollment counts. Gives the board some time for reviewing, basically 2 months. And then gives families and students adequate notice to discontinue. The thing is, I don't see that applying to student performance or other areas. I simply see it tying to the demographics.
First, a question for Mary. When you say, what year are you talking about where you would like to see that? After year 1, after year 2, after year 3? I'm just trying to...
After year 3.
Okay.
I believe that there's...
So that would be in the middle of year 3. Okay.
Well,
as opposed to this process here begins at the start of year 4, essentially.
Or literally on the last day of year 3.
Yeah.
That's
so,
right.
Yeah,
that's
that,
right.
I guess
I
that,
would,
that's what I was
right,
just
because then start of year 4, then you're operating year 4, and I think that I would like to make sure that the school has right from the start understands very clearly that this is not something that this is basically a requirement. It's not we'll review it and then do a warning and whatever. It's that if the board at that time in their capacity decides that very much will be the intent, I'm not saying we write it in that if demographics aren't achieved by that date, that it would terminate, but at least allow the board to act, to be able to say that they decide at that point. But otherwise, it feels like our the soonest would be really at the end of year 4.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
I was going to stay on that for a second.
Yeah, if you can stay on that, fine. I'll go back. I've got other things, but yeah.
Okay. I was curious about the general time frame for the lottery that happens during the second year for the third year. So when would the school generally know the demographic makeup of actually going into the 4th year? I'm off a year. 3rd year going into 4th.
Right. So then, so are we looking at 3rd Friday of the 3rd year cumulative, or could the 4th year lottery cure some of that? I think is what I'm hearing.
That's what I'm trying to, yeah.
And that would be January-ish.
January-ish, yeah. So I think that helps maybe think about how we could adjust that date.
Yeah, let me first a partial answer and slightly different answer to Nikki is that we have a distinction here that there is the power to revoke is in there under certain circumstances, and one of them is failure to make academic progress is defined under Chapter 118. And so that's a general and kind of ill-defined power to revoke on academics, but it is there, and it continues to be there. It would be a very, very difficult process to do that, and I don't think, and that's separate from this. What we're doing is we're saying that what we're doing is, this is a review, have to consider it, I think, separately. I think in some ways we have to consider it separately from the renewal process. This is, something that is in between those two, perhaps. But this brings me to, Laura's talked about how the demographics and what the expectations are there are not well defined. And, Dylan said is 22%, if the district's 25% is 22% meeting expectations. And, and I honestly don't know that. And I think that, that with the financial ones, particularly the fundraising efforts is relatively well defined. I think the demographics are actually that reflecting the racial and ethnic special education and socioeconomic status of the district. I think that, I'd rather have within some kind of percentage point put there to clarify it. But I think that would be, I don't think there would be a lot of arguing around if we were to use that to invoke this process. However, the academic outcomes, I don't see any clarity at all. And what are the expectations for academic outcomes? Dylan, you referred to the charter school renewal rubric. The only academic outcomes that are listed in the charter school renewal rubric are growth measures. We don't have growth measures for the PALS test at all. And growth, we can talk about whether they're appropriate or not, but they're literally the only ones in the charter school review rubric right now. And the growth measures don't say anything specifically about performance gaps. So if we have expectations tied to performance gaps, and we're referring to a rubric that doesn't actually set expectations for performance gaps, and then even then, are we talking about performance gaps defining as performance gaps of students within the school, performance gaps versus the district, performance gaps versus national gaps? Are we talking about the last year? Are we talking about the data from year 3? Are we talking about cumulative data from year 1 to 3? All those things aren't defined, and if the board is saying we want an opportunity to invoke a special process based on academic outcomes, I want to know when we have the power and when we don't have the power to invoke that. And I think the people on the other side of the contract would want to know that also in much, much clearer terms. So that expectations, it's difficult.
Mary?
TJ, I'm with you on clarity with regard to the process, but I'll say I'm not there with regards to academic measures that we define very specifically, Because the more narrow we define it, the more there will be teaching to one specific standard. I have no doubt that with the assessment that's done from our Andrews Fine Department, I think we know very clearly whether there's academic progress being made, particularly among the students who we know we aren't supporting in the ways that are improving those at least quick enough. And that's why I do support this school, because as Dean mentioned, no one has actually spoken out against the Montessori method. And so if this is something that we should be having or incorporating in our schools, or having more schools, public schools that we control that have this, then this is a great way of finding out. And so I am with the academic measures, but I'm very concerned about the downside, the unintended consequences of spelling it out so clearly, whether it's MAP or PALS or proficiency, whatever it is. I think that's one of the big problems we have as a district overall, is the emphasis on academic measures. All of us want the same thing, but I'm concerned about it. So I would not, I'd have the process that triggers the review, but I would not be in favor of narrowly defining what those measures are.
Yeah, for me, I think the accountability section is really the most important section, because I mean, one of the things we've heard historically, years in the charter school conversation, is about how the board doesn't have any backbone to close a charter or to hold charters accountable. And that's why I thought it was so important that we really work on the accountability piece, and that the fact that we can look at this from year to year and review it from year to year will give us a chance to evaluate where we are on a very short time interval. And so, you know, when you get into these charter school conversations, you know, so many things comes up that you can bring up budget issues. I mean, it's just no way you're going to have perfection across all of these interest groups that have. I mean, there's just too many things that we can talk about that we don't like. But I'm not sure that they have much to do with academic achievement. My main motivating factor here is academic achievement, to give kids an opportunity. Some of the kids that have not had an opportunity in this district, no matter what anyone says, the bottom line is that we have not served kids of color well in this district for 50 years. So we can sit around this table, and I'm the only one at this table of color. I'm the one that has the experience, so everybody else can talk theoretically, but I'm the only one sitting here that experiences it, whose families experience it for generations. And you hear things about, well, you don't serve enough kids. Well, how many kids do we have to serve? We're not serving enough kids in our main classrooms that have been successful kids of color. So how many do we have to serve? For a person of color like myself, if we can serve 5 kids or 1 kid more than we're serving now, for me, that's better than what we're doing. And I want to give everyone an opportunity to be successful in this district. This is about working on the margin. The main thrust for this district to serve all kids is in the core classroom. It's not charter schools. This is all about improving right around the edges and at the margin. If we're gonna make huge gains in education and academic achievement, it has to be done in our normal classrooms. That's what has to be done. It's core instruction. Here we're talking about working around the margins. This is a marginality, basically. So if we can basically show some improvements for a certain amount of our kids, a small amount of our kids, for me, a person of color. Now, your vision is different than mine. I live it every day. I can't escape it. For a person of color, this is very important to me. So that's why the most important aspect in this is demographics to me. It's the demographics piece. Because I am totally there, and that's why we put in annual reviews in a 3-year cycle. I'm totally there that if the school does not meet the demographics portion, the demographics piece, then we got a problem. I'm going to have a problem with it because I am interested in finding out whether or not this method can serve kids of color. This is a pilot. We're trying to figure this out. And so I'm all in for trying to figure out whether or not this particular approach can serve kids of color. And so for me, the accountability piece is what's really most important. Who cleans the school? Look, I don't know anyone around this table paying union dues except me. I pay union dues. I've been paying them for 40 straight years. I'm a union member. Yeah, I'd like to see our staff clean the school. But I'm not sure what that has to do with academic achievement. I'm trying to figure out right now how we improve education of kids. And so, yeah, it'd be great if we can figure out a way that our staff cleans the buildings and work in the buildings. I'm all for that. But that cannot be a decision piece for me in terms of increasing academic achievement for kids of color. For me, that can't be a piece of it. That, to me, is something I support. I support it. But I'm basically focusing on academic achievement. Nikki.
I respect what you say, James, and I understand that, and we have not done a good job of teaching children of color. I cannot disagree with you whatsoever. What I can ask is just one question, and that is, when we are right now we haven't had a special ed increase in 10 years. We're using our general fund, some of it, to fund our special ed. If we take more money from the general fund, to correct me if I'm wrong, then all schools get less. And if we're addressing everyone, and we're addressing everyone except the fringes, how do we justify taking that much from the majority, including those students of color who can't and don't go to Montessori or aren't picked in the lottery? How do we do that?
That's a budget question. And I don't know how to answer these questions. How am I taking away? I don't see that we're taking anything away from our other schools. There's nothing being deducted from our schools. And Mike, I mean, if you wanted to weigh in on that. But people say, well, we're taking something away from our other schools. We're not. I haven't seen any budget analysis that says that any school is going to be deducted by creating a school or any budget impact on our other schools.
James, I just want to make a comment about the accountability whenever Mike's done.
James, can I make a suggestion? I thought that earlier Nikki had had a process clarification, which was about whether or not we would touch on the budget, and you said yes. So I would suggest maybe potentially finishing on accountability and then going to budget next.
That's a good suggestion. Anna.
Sure. My comments around accountability is actually, I'm deeply concerned, and I put a priority on not only demographics but also academic progress. If we're serving a diverse student body, but when we find once they're in the school they're not being academically successful, I think that's important information for us to have, and it gives us a direction that perhaps, despite what we hear, that it might not be working for a variety of reasons. So within that, I think academic progress as well as demographics need to be measured.
Dean and TJ?
I think you heard that the 3-year out, we want some options there, and Mary kind of said it. Do we have to make a motion on that?
We can't change a contract on the floor.
I mean, you're hearing this, and
Right.
I think it's the consensus here.
Yeah. So I actually just looked at Kelly, I'm like, and this means what? Right, because right now we have a negotiated contract. And so I'd like to listen to the rest of the discussion, but I need to think through my head, because I've actually heard a couple of things more than just the 3-year option. I messed up that first sentence, so it'd have to be in section 8. I heard the only teachers with the involuntary transfer as a substantive I heard the feedback on the process and all of that, but the substantive of that, and this 3 years, especially around the student demographics. So I've heard it all. I'm just not sure yet what the procedural implication is, so I have to think about it. Because I don't.
Just very brief response to Mary, that I see it as 2 things. Number one is that I agree with you completely that you corrupt the process if the only thing we're judging on is very limited and well-defined metrics in terms of whether we would be moving forward after 3 years. But I do think that limited and well-defined metrics would be appropriate and very, very useful in triggering that process. So not to decide the process, but to trigger it. I think that, and so I guess that's a distinction that a partial agreement and a partial disagreement.
So do you see that that's necessary versus that, I'm sort of thinking about Dean's and James's point and Anna's point is that we will assess. I mean, we basically will have an assessment of academic progress, and we'll be looking at it annually. And I don't see that we need, like, that can be whatever we define it to be. And I didn't know that we're limited from a review.
Well, what I read, as I read this, and perhaps Dylan can correct me, is that if the board finds it has not met expectations, then if IMACS applies for a renewal, and the board finds to get all the steps that it has not met expectations, then we can give 30 days notice and invoke this process, and from this process can either come a remediation plan or a closure at the end of year 3, essentially.
And that's up to the board to decide.
And so I guess that, well, this isn't a contract and there's 2 parties to the contract. And what I see with the lack of definition, I see kind of 2 problems, or 2 places where problems could occur. One is a disagreement among the board about whether expectations have been met. And 3 people are saying, this is what I expected, and 3 people are saying this is not what I expected, and one person's going, and so I can see that is the issue. The other issue is I can see a disagreement between us and IMACS, and if we were unanimous in saying, or a majority said that expectations haven't been met, and IMACS says, well, yes, they have. You can't invoke this clause. And so those are 2 places where I see a lack of clarity could cause future issues unnecessarily.
Can I ask a clarifying question of Dylan? So, go ahead, Dean.
No, I didn't quite get what you were saying, but
on which one? Okay.
So on the first point, that's the board, right? I mean, if we can't come, it's always, if we're going to close a school, it's going to come down to a board vote. I mean, I don't know any way, I certainly wouldn't want to put in a formula that somehow automatically closes a school based on something. So I think it's going to come down to a board vote to review it in any case. So can you clarify that?
Well,
you seem like I'm misunderstanding it.
There's the step is to invoke a process. The process can lead to, the process is a review. The review then can lead to a remediation plan. It can lead to closure. It can lead to nothing. And so what I'm saying is that the metrics to start that process, not metrics that say these metrics aren't met, school closes by any means. Metrics to start an agreement up front on how that's defined, what the expectations are. I've said this before in another context, but very similar, that state law requires us to have clarity around goals, and we don't have them.
So can I just on the point, a clarification, Dylan. So of the 3 options that on the review, who determines which of the 3 options are undertaken? The option either for a plan for remediation or whatever, a closure, or basically neither of those.
So the initial is triggered by the renewal application. And those 3 areas that are set out as the 3 focus areas, demographics, financials, and student outcomes, we say we link that to the renewal application rubric, which, TJ, it does say growth, but not growth. So it says school meets growth expectations, uses district's goal setting. So it's not the measure of growth, it's the expectations of growth in the data. I mean, I wrote it.
No, but it says growth using district goal setting and
which is
so
linked to the SIP plan, which is the accountability.
No, I went to the SIP thing, and growth is defined by the 2 to 5%, and That's growth is defined in one way, proficiency standards are defined in a different way. That word growth there says to me that these are map growth measures, and I'm sorry, but that's not, and if it's anything else, that's not clear at all.
Can I get an answer to my question before this growth thing goes back and forth?
So if using the rubric, they meet expectations across the board, it would arguably not go to the board at all. If an area failed to meet expectations, then that area, that would go to the board, or the board would be informed of that, and then they have the opportunity to say, hey, we want to take this out of administration's hands, which would do a improvement plan, and we either just want to be more active in the improvement plan, or we want to look at this for a potential of closing the school prior to the termination of the contract.
And it is spelled out that that's an internal review that does not come to the board.
Yep, sorry, I'm just trying to go between frames. So right now it is worded that if at the time of the review, so it says, notice of intent to seek renewal as set forth above, MMSD shall conduct a midterm review on the then current state of IMACS in each of the 3 areas. So those will be the 3 focus areas that are immediately reviewed for the 3 years versus using the 2-year renewal process. Student enrollment, financial stability, academic outcomes. If at time of review they fail to meet expectations, then they'll be expected to develop a plan. If they don't show adequate improvement in any of the areas, such information shall be communicated to the board. If IMACS fails, the new language is, if IMACS fails to meet expectations in any area, which is defined by the areas within that paragraph, the Board of Education may, with 30 days written notice to the council, schedule a special meeting to review the findings and outcomes. At that meeting, the board may establish expectations and directives required for remediation and improvement, or vote to close IMACS at the end of the then current school year.
Yeah, and the contract also says that IMA will be judged and evaluated based on the same parameters that our normal schools are. All the same tests, state tests and all. Right?
And then, yes, and then in the revocation of the contract during the term of the contract, which is section 22 above, pupils in MMS may be terminated during the term of the contract by MMSD board if the board finds that the pupils enrolled in the charter school fail to make sufficient academic progress as set forth in the statutes, or that they violated the contract.
Since I think we're looking at some possible changes to this, and I hope that there's actually a way that we can approve the contract with amendments, and then it's up to the school to accept it. So I understand that it's a one way, but certainly the board can do that. I think TJ brings up a good point as to if there aren't clear measures of what academic progress is, and it's not coming to the board. So the board is, it's having an internal review to determine whether in fact there has been adequate academic progress, the finances, the enrollment. I just wondered if we could tweak that in fact it is, that does come to the board to determine whether in fact the expectations are being met.
So I will just say this, and TJ, let me just finish my thought, and then if you disagree, but so the rubric does use the term growth, but not growth as the measure of student growth, but growth as the measure of, you at 12% proficient, we set growth expectations of up to 15%. So did you grow in, so that is how, having been the scrivener was my intent. I will take any feedback that I am mixing nomenclature, and that is fine. But right now it says the school meets standard growth expectation using the district's goal setting methodology, because we've linked it to the SIP process by subgroups and demonstrates acceleration for one or more subgroups. So
I can just say that I followed that trail from here to how the SIP goal setting, and at no time did I consider that growth didn't mean the map growth measures we use. I mean, at no time did that even occur to me that was a possibility. And so, I mean, what's that?
We set goals at both growth goals and proficiency goals,
but
growing our success.
But the rubric doesn't say proficiency, it says only growth, and I assume that only growth goals are there. And I mean, I think that's a valid assumption. I mean, it's you know, I mean, and this goes back to the lack of clarity, that if I have to follow 3 things, and that if I took a place there where, you know, I mean, I read pretty closely, and
okay, we're going to have
Can
to
I
make a
make a
recommendation here.
comment?
Jan, I'll let you weigh in, and
Okay.
if we're to make a change, we need to move on that. But we can go back and forth on whether it's growth and
Yeah.
all night.
And I respect that in Dylan's role as Scrivener, it might not have come through as clear as we would have liked, but, and that's not your fault, Dylan. I think the main point is that we measure growth using our goal-setting methodology as described in the school improvement planning process. And as a reminder to the board, that goal-setting methodology is a package of indicators. It is not just MAP scores in literacy and mathematics. It includes, at the elementary level, PALS, MAP, the climate survey results, and I think, well, access to arts education, which may not be a major issue for this particular school. Nevertheless, it is a package. Our school set goals in all 3 of our goal-setting areas. One is about traditional measures of academic achievement. One is about access and participation to a well-rounded educational experience, and then there's a set of metrics around school climate as measured by parents' response levels, student response levels, and teachers. So just as a reminder, when we talk about SIP goal-setting methodology, we're talking about a fairly robust set of metrics. I think the second point I want to make is that the board will be rewriting, with assistance from our team and the entire community, the strategic framework this next year, which could very well lead to some adjustments in our goals and our goal-setting methodology. So I go back to the idea that using the language that Dylan was trying to build into the rubric, that we're aligning every school's goal setting to the district's goal setting methodology, is really important. If you were to try to define that more than that, I mean, the goal setting methodology is subject to change as a district. As we get smarter and we learn how to measure our school's progress in better and more well-rounded ways. So, just as a reminder, that's what we mean by the SIP goal-setting methodology. There is actually quite a lot of meaning in that small number of words.
Okay, thank you. Laura, it seemed like you had your hand up a while ago and I didn't recognize it, or did you?
I have something that I have to be at 7. And,
well, I can appreciate that.
So,
we'll write you a note.
Excuse myself for...
Okay, that's fine.
Just
Nikki, then we'll go back and see if there's any suggested change, or if we're going to move on from that, and then we're going to conclude this session.
James, can I jump in after Nikki?
Yes.
Yeah. Two things. Sorry, Kate, don't mean to step on you there. 2 things. One, I have to agree with Mary. I think if it's not meeting expectations academically, it needs to go to the board, not an internal review. I think that wouldn't be difficult to make. I respect the board. I respect the internal process, but I think this just adds a layer of transparency. My other issue is, again, I look at it as a lawyer, other people look at it as a human being. But if I'm IMA or MMSD, either one, I want to know in advance what the terms are before I sign anything.
Mm-hmm.
I want to make sure that both sides understand where we are. Because if I'm signing something, I'm signing an oath, I'm signing an agreement, I will follow it. How could I agree to follow something if I don't know what I'm agreeing to?
Yeah.
It's a comment.
All right, thank you. You want, let's go to Kate first and then.
Oh, yeah, sure. And then I want to comment
yes,
on
Kate.
this issue.
You guys can finish out. I kind of grouped my comments since I'm remote. I didn't want to jump in and out. So if you guys want to finish that out, I'm happy.
We're just about finished out. We might as well take your group comments now.
So I guess I have three kind of big points. I want to maybe start with just the enrollment and preferences and kind of come back to that because this was the first time I guess I understood that that 10% would apply to a new set of students every year. So if I understand that right, that's 20 students out of 200 that would be eligible for the staff preference every year.
Sorry, Kate, say your math again.
It's 20, it's 10% of 200, right?
It's 10% of that year's total enrollment.
Okay.
So I think it starts a little smaller.
So it starts a little smaller and ends a little bigger than that, but that's essentially the whole 4K class, right? I mean, a class is 20 students. So in theory, and clearly this won't happen because there's not that many staff, but in theory, every entering student could be entering via preference.
In theory.
So
sorry, I was nodding, Kate, instead of talking. I apologize.
Okay. Thank you. I am watching on video, although there's a time delay. So I guess, we keep coming back to this question of demographics. It's the thing that I feel most passionately about with any of our alternatives. And I commend you, Dylan and Kelly, and the folks at IMA for working through kind of DPI's new interpretations of charter law and how to manage that. Try to get us as close as possible to what we want. But I have to say that listening to this, I question whether the charter process is the right process to be doing this in. I am not sure it gives us the flexibility to manage mobility of students, to manage mobility of particularly our low-income families. I think that we are tying our hands more than we maybe want to. And so, and I would be concerned with the school meeting their demographics if every entering 4K student could be coming in with a preference. That's concerning to me. So, I think for me there's a bigger question there than simply kind of what's the next turn of how we kind of get around, because I actually think many of us are trying to find a better solution to get this school to be as targeted as we can at the students we believe we want to be supporting better. And I'm not sure that the state laws get us there. So that was point one. The second is, this school is a really small school on the east side and north side, and the east side and north side, particularly the north side, have several other very small schools. We know that they are challenging to manage from an enrollment perspective. We know that they are challenging to manage from a financial perspective. We know that small fluctuations in specific students drive relatively large changes sometimes in staffing. And so I keep coming back to, this is a fundamental fact that is, it's challenging to manage, and we know that there are other ways to do it, right? So maybe that's the second point to throw out there. And then the last, Dean, I actually want to come back to your initial comments because I've heard it several times from various people, which is, we would have preferred to do this ourselves. I hear that, and part of me thinks that it would be wiser for us to do something like this ourselves because we would have far more flexibility around internal transfers, around guiding who has access to the school, around managing some of those mobility challenges. But we also didn't do this ourselves. We chose to invest in other areas that we as a district believed made a bigger impact on more students. We chose to do pathways, we chose to shore up literacy, we chose to do things that are making progress nowhere close to fast enough. Absolutely not. I mean, we rolled our annual report. I think one of our speakers tonight brought it up the same night as we started talking about this, and we are not making progress fast enough, full stop. So but I also come back to the fact that this is not a part of our kind of strategic framework of how we believed we should unlock achievement. And James, I really appreciate your comments tonight, and I think this is a week for all of us to listen deeply to them. So, you know, for me, this is not about charters. This is not about a philosophical opposition to alternatives. I believe we need to be exploring alternatives. We have to be faster. We have to be more innovative. But I also want to do that in a way that is the best way that we can use our funds, the best way that we can target those funds at the right ages and the right location. And I'm not, you know, I mean, we're still talking about fundamental questions like what good looks like, right? What does success look like around the school, which is I wouldn't want to pre-approve a contract again, which is I think what the board did in January, kind of with loose ends. Like that doesn't feel like a good choice right now. So I'll stop, but I just wanted to kind of share those thoughts.
Jen, did you want to? Thank you, Kate. Jen, did you want to weigh in here?
I forgot what I was going to say.
Okay. All right. So what I suggest then is that we deal with the budget issue, and unless, and then we'll do summations at that point. But let's deal with the budget issue that Nikki raised about the question around how a school like this impact our other schools as it's taken away from other schools. So Mike or whomever, if you can comment on that.
Can I add one thing to my question? If that's okay, James?
Oh, go ahead and add. Nikki wants to add one thing.
And just, I wanted clarification that if there is a limited pool of money, where it comes from. 1, 2, are we using our general fund to pay special ed? And how would Montessori affect that?
Okay, I'll try to deal with those in the order that they were asked.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Mike.
Sure. So I guess what I wanted to say about budget is you know, first of all, you know, the budget is driven by the larger goals and purpose of this investment. If you go back and look at our budget goals, the goals that drove the 17-18 budget, it says things like allocate resources for greatest impact on students, raising achievement and narrowing gaps, leverage priority actions to accelerate gap narrowing progress, support opportunities to innovate. So you see that language in our budget, and that's what drives us. So what you have here tonight is essentially a targeted allocation, a targeted investment on the Northeast side. And it happens to be a charter, but it's really, for budget purposes, a targeted investment. There are all kinds of charters, and then you know, those charters that are very entrepreneurial, you see them all over the state, that are all, especially like those online virtuals, are all about manufacturing enrollment for basically revenue purposes. This is not one of those types of charters. I don't think any of us have any appetite for that type of charter anyway. This is really a targeted investment, and you know, just from the budget, it's $1.5 million as it starts out. It could ultimately grow to $2 million in terms of total expenditures. Now, some of that will be offset depending on the extent to which new to the school district kids enroll. We've had those discussions. Most, I assume, will not be new to MMSD. There'll be kids coming from existing schools. So we're going to make this targeted investment, and we're going to use our budget values because we think it aligns to that. Ultimately, it will come down then to, does this allocation on the Northeast side, and for whatever good it does it create some harm elsewhere? And I don't accept the premise that it's a zero-sum game, and if you make this investment on Northeast side, that there has to be an equal amount of pain elsewhere. It's not usually how we've approached budgeting. It's our job to find solutions that work for everybody. And in the course of our 6 or 8 months of budget deliberation over the $350 million operating budget, I think we've been able to bring you solutions that show wise use of resources. If we thought that we were going to be cutting and harming 6 or 7 other schools on the Northeast side, I don't think any of us would support that. It's not the idea here. But if you're going to challenge our budget team to come up with $1 million, $1.5 million worth of smart allocation of resources, I'm sure we can do it. We do it all the time.
Can I add one more thing? I'm sorry, James, and I know I'm not trying to manipulate. I just have one more question.
On budget.
It is on budget. My other question is this: what happens with an IEP if Montessori cannot meet it? Do we as MMSD have to provide those services, and where would that money come from?
Well, let's not stray too far. I mean, because you can attach everything we talk about here to a dollar somehow. So let's not stray too far. But if you want to answer, if you can talk about the IEP, but.
I'll try to answer it, and you guys chime in. The way that charters work in our district is that they're instrumentality charters. That means this is our school. It's not theirs or them, it's ours. I need to remind you guys, when we have a principals meeting, the principal Badger Rock is in the room. The principal of Wright, and not knowing that that's now a magnet, but has been a charter for a long time, is in the room. They function as full members of our leadership team, and their students are our students. So if a student has an IEP that requires such specialized services, it's our school, it's our kid, our child that we're obligated to serve. So we provide the services. That's what we do in any school in MMSD. That's what we're required to do by law.
All right, thank you. Before we move to final comments here.
On budget?
I have budget.
Budget.
All right,
Yeah.
Anna?
So my question is around the open enrollment, the new budget that you all put together where you secured some additional secured additional funding by using the dollars that would follow a student with an IEP into the district versus a student without an IEP. And then I saw that there was a change. For some reason, I'm looking at all my documents and I can't get the updated budget that I saw earlier this weekend.
It's in the attendance, the one labeled attendance. It's
Okay,
page 3.
sorry, thanks. I was looking. So I saw that there was an incremental increase in an SEA and maybe a CC teacher, cross-categorical teacher. But the amount generated by make that change doesn't seem to equate to an increase in specialized staffing. So where is that money going? And I don't have the specific figures.
Like OT, PT, specialized staffing?
Well,
Or
no, I
CC
think
and
based,
SEA?
my computer died where I had the numbers. So
I can pull up, see.
my question is, the additional money doesn't seem to equate to additional special education staffing. So is the money being used to improve the long-term budget?
And the CC teacher and SCA line item went up across all 5 years.
But that only accounts for 48% of the $300,000 that was added via this change in budgeting. So
Yes, I had the 48%. So I was just asking where the other 52% is.
Abstains. Wasn't fast enough.
And an answer to that would be it's in the budget. I mean, it's integrated throughout the budget. So what they did is they took their CC teacher and their SEA allocation, considering the percentage of special ed students that they have, allocated to the staffing model that they needed.
James, can I make a process suggestion for our team? And if you guys
Sure.
want to answer or ask, put out more thoughts or questions on the budget, by all means do. But there have been, at least for kind of fundamental issues raised on the contract, and I think that we would like, after 2 hours of this meeting going on, we'd like to request a 5-minute recess. We need to talk about, process-wise, what the right way forward is. So I'll make that.
Recess?
I do, after these budget questions.
After the budget question?
You can finish the budget section, and I would like to respectfully request a short recess.
Maybe I could ask Anna's question a little differently, and maybe this will lead to some clarity. If that would be all right, James?
Go for it.
And I think what Anna is asking is that by using a different calculation in the charter school funding formula for special education students, that it adds about $335,000, about 100, and I think it's about 130,000 over the course is then spent on special education staffing, and so that there is that disconnect. That is actually that first number was wrong. Actually, it's actually adds. I don't have my numbers in front of me, but that's the question is that Anna is getting at, and I think Kelly's answer was correct, that it goes into general operations, and I mean, and so that, I mean, that's but
yeah, and the logic behind that would be without the $12,000, that wasn't included in there at all in the first time through the budget. So I don't know that I don't know your calculation. From what I'm hearing, I don't think your calculation is like a 12% revenue to a 12% expenditure. I think you're taking what the new revenue is in the new expenses. Do you see the difference? The 12,000 wasn't in there before.
I definitely see the difference.
Okay.
I mean, I definitely see the difference, and I understand, and that it is that. I mean, I understand that there was a base level of special education staffing that was just based on the 8,700, 6,800, right? And that, in fact, the total special education staffing is, in the new version of the budget, is actually greater than the difference between that 8,000 and the 6,000 and the 12,000. I get that. I guess, yeah, I get that.
Okay, well,
Okay.
Anna's still got the floor.
Yeah, I was just looking at the numbers and wondering where it was, and then, so when you say it goes to the general fund, the additional dollars?
Well, it goes from a negative operating expenditure to a positive operating expenditure.
But is that money from DPI? Is that Fund 27 or is that Fund 10?
Money from DPI.
Okay.
It's remembering how that money came to be, and it's because the contract says, the charter policy, Charter 10,000, says here's how we allocate funds to our charter schools. It's at the pure pupil state transfer amount, and there are two now open enrollment state transfer amounts. There's the special ed amount and the regular ed amount. And so it actually just, some of it goes into special ed, more special ed, and some of it just goes to changing the overall bottom line. It's not more money to or from DPI. It's a different calculation based on how the policy said money would be allocated to the school. So I think that is does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, and I just my final concern is just, yeah, no, just the general concern is that I'm a little cautious about changing how we do something midway through a process, and then what precedent that sets, and then also what is the impact on the other charter schools that we have and how that will impact them as well.
Yeah. I think that is all fair. I will say that change to the process had grandfathered other charter schools in. This is our first new charter school that is using that policy shift, which maybe a year from now we'll even have a different formula. But just so you're aware, like, that was never actually applied to Badger Rock, Wright, or NMCS, because that policy wasn't in place when they were created or when they've been budgeted for.
The board's policy was in place, and that policy hasn't changed. But what did change was the state introduced 2 open enrollment amounts in 2016-17. And so those earlier examples preceded that rule, and that's why the adjustment was made this year.
Jen, did you have a comment?
I would love to offer the comment that I'd forgotten from earlier,
Okay.
if that's okay.
If you agree, sure.
This brings us back to the 3-year renewal. And there was a suggestion that the administrative team not take on the role of reviewing the progress of the charter using our rubric, and that it goes straight to the board. I would just suggest to the board that we continue to use the process of having the team do a deep review, offer the board the rubric. You have in the past taken into consideration our scores on the rubric and made a different decision, and I think it would. I think the board would benefit from having the administrative team's deep review for your consideration before making your own decision about whether or not it meets expectations.
Appreciate it. We're going to take the final 2 comments. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back for final comments. So get your last comments in here.
On budget.
Can I just comment on, and Jen, thank you. I had, I was assuming that, so, yes, I would, since I made that recommendation, I would support your addition. Thank you.
Before on budget, I want to say that I like what Mary suggested better than what's currently there in terms of that process. I would like to have clearly defined expectations even more, but on to budget. One of the few things that we're actually required by state law and our policy to consider is the fiscal impact on the district. And I think that, we have bits and pieces of it here. The overall fiscal impact over 5 years comes to over 7.7 million as an estimated amount. If special education or English language learner costs are higher, if fundraising is lower, there's a number of other factors that play into how that will affect it. But 7.7 is the number we have. And though I respect our budget team and our budget process, there's no question that there is the pie. There is in some sense a zero-sum game. Money we spend here, we can't spend there. And no, I don't think that this school will cause pain elsewhere. I don't think it will do harm elsewhere. I do think that pulling $1.5 million out of our district as a whole, which in the light of our entire size budget is not a huge amount, will limit the good we can do elsewhere. And I think that that's part of the fiscal impact on the district. There's no question about it. How much of that will be taken up by equalization aid and how much of that will come from the taxpayers, we don't know. I mean, these are all kind of speculative things, but it does come down to, by my calculations, almost certainly at least $7.7 million over 5 years, which is not an inconsiderable amount of money. Secondly, on the budget matters is has to do with 2 different calculations as they appear currently in the budget. One is the calculation for the true cost of 3K, which is not a calculation for the true cost of 3K by anyone's definition. DPI instructed us that we had to include the full cost of those classrooms. I don't think anyone believes that that is a good estimate of that. I think that a conservative estimate would be $95,000. We're at like $56,000 for 1/3 of the cost of the 3K2 classrooms. I see no reason why that hasn't been corrected, and I think that also changes some of the budget picture a little bit. And then the third piece is what Anna brought up, which is the question around, and Dylan responded to this partially, which is that we changed the interpretation of our charter school policy at the very end of a process that's been going on for a year. Those laws were changed 2 years ago. I think that this is a possibly valid interpretation of the policy. I think it might even be a better one. But it's not one that was ever mentioned in the 2 years since the state law changed, nor in the year of considering this. And in my mind, it is more than a reinterpretation. It is a rewrite of our charter school policy that is being done in the context of a contract approval. And we don't have before us a discussion of, do you want to rewrite or reinterpret your charter school policy? We have a yes or no vote on the contract approval. If we approve that contract, our policy is rewritten or reinterpreted. If you want, I would go with rewritten, but I will accept reinterpreted. I can see reasons why this is a better way to do it. I can also see reasons why it's not an appropriate change. And I'm not, and that's a discussion I think we need to have about how we fund charter schools. It's one we haven't had, and it's one we should not decide by a new budget in a contract, attached to a contract that literally, this has never been broached in the 2 years since the state law was done. It's never been broached I mean, we've got dozens of documents with budgets around this charter school where this has never, ever
Do you
been
have a
part
specific budget comment, TJ?
That is a specific budget comment, James.
All right, can we-
It is about the budget here. It is about how this budget is being used to rewrite our policy.
Sound like a more of a policy comment to me.
Well, it's a budget comment.
Yeah.
And so that's, that's all I have to say is that I don't like being put in this position.
Just disagree.
All right, so this is the last comment here.
Yeah, so on budget, I think if we go back to the initial analysis that the board looked at, there's a lot of factors, TJ, that I don't think are just come down to taking the total amount and coming up with 7.5 million. One of the reasons that the school made sense is the possibility that we're bringing in students who are not currently part of MMSD, and therefore we bring in new revenue authority. So I think that needs to be taken into account on the other side of this. Also, even with this higher amount of funding, you're looking at a cost of educating the students that is under $9,000 per student. That is one of the lowest of any of our schools. That, to me, is something that we should be thinking about how, again, on a pilot basis, what it can tell us about how we can make sure that we are having the greatest impact with the resources that we have. And so I think it's also, this is a different model. There's no doubt about it, but in terms of its cost per student, we need to recognize that it is one of the lowest costs per students that we have, and as we try to have greater and greater impact with our students, with not a lot of greater impact or greater amounts of money, and we want to make sure that we are compensating our staff not only adequately, but fairly. I think it's really important that we actually look at some other ways that potentially we can have greater impact with lesser dollars.
Thank you. And actually, I've heard less per student. That was actually higher than I had seen that number of 9,000. So, Mike, is that the number you have? Is it about 9,000 per student? Or is it
Depending on the assumptions, it's somewhere between $8,000 and $9,000.
All right, so I think it's time for a 5-minute break, and
Thank you, James.
And we'll come back for final comments. 5 minutes, and we'll start.
Sorry, move.
Hey, Dylan, do you want to go?
In a few minutes here, and then we'll have our final comments as board members, and then we'll move on to the vote. And that's the plan here moving forward. So, Jen.
Thank you, James. I wanted to just say a few things, and then I'll pass it over to Dylan, who's got a kind of process and proposal for us that I hope will lead to a vote. Assuming that it does, I wanted to say a few things no matter how the vote turns out. One is a reminder that we've gotten this far, which is very far into this process, past several gates and many months of work with IMA, because at the heart of this proposal is this idea that we can provide more access to students, specifically students of color, and you mentioned that, James, who would not otherwise have this option. And I think that's why this proposal has stayed alive for as long as it has, because I think many of us see the hope and opportunity there, and that even if it is marginal positive impact, because it's a small school, we highlighted a small school, Lindbergh, in our annual report this year that I think is making an enormous positive marginal impact with a small number of students just this year. We think it's worth it to make that kind of positive impact. I think the second thing that's interesting to me is going back to my comments about we and us. The board, through your policy, and I'm sure through future iterations of your policy, will always stay committed to instrumentality charter schools, right, which are our schools. They are ours with our students. So I just want to say that out loud. I think it's important that we aren't positioning ourselves at odds with our own schools that serve our own students. And then the last thing I wanted to say before you guys make your decision about the contract is I hope that in the future, if not now, in the future, we can make room for what I'll call grassroots proposals, right? These are proposals that come from our community. That's what happened in this case with IMA. I think it's important for us as a district to make room for ideas that weren't originally ours, right? They were someone else's. They were coming from the community that we serve. I think that's really powerful. And there ought to be a set of core values that help us decide whether or not that proposal is a good one and forwards our vision and mission as a school district, but that we honor and value proposals that come from our community. They're not going to be necessarily perfect or what we would have written if we had written it, but I don't know why that makes it necessarily better or worse. So I want to just say that too. Again, no matter what happens with this vote, I think it's an important idea. So I'll pass it over to Dylan. She has a proposal that she'll pass around that we think addresses the very specific issues that were brought up in the last couple of hours of conversation.
Which issues? You say issues or issues?
Yep, you'll see it come around. This gets at some of the language that we accidentally didn't edit out of the contract, the internal transfer issue that TJ brought up.
Yeah, that's what I was asking.
Kate, I'll email it to you right now.
We'll get it to Kate. It includes the renewal language that Mary offered. So Dylan, do you want to just walk them through this real quick?
Yeah, just in an effort of having, because we have no pending motion at the moment. And so my proposal would be to make a motion to direct certain changes to the contract in line with what Mary had said. I think I have captured those changes. My intent is not to put words in anybody's mouths, but capture what I think I heard. And so I would recommend making a motion to approve the contract as prepared for tonight's special meeting, right? Which includes the following changes and or amendments: modifying Section 8 of the proposed contract to reflect the modifications to attendance area set forth in Section 9. That was just a carryover. including a prohibition against involuntary staff transfers, not just teachers, in section 20. Those are the two. And then modification to section 26 to reflect a timeline for the 3-year review of student demographics, separate from the timeline for notice of intent to seek renewal, specifically to be addressed following the initial lottery period in anticipation of the 4th year of operation, so about February 2021. And to clarify that the board shall review the administration's findings following the 3-year review, regardless of conclusions or outcomes. And so, again, that is just to have something so that we're not doing what we were doing on the fly last time and watch Dylan write inartfully. I at least tried to have something to reflect and respond to.
Thank you, appreciate it. I think it does capture what we talked about here.
Well, I'll move for discussion. Move to accept.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Okay, so so on the floor, this document, if anyone wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, Dylan, the last modification of section 26, does that mean that similar to what Mary had suggested, that the demographics we could easily get in the middle of the year?
Yes.
And then we review that and didn't meet expectation, then
we could make that decision within the, right, so in February 2021 is when we would look at those versus waiting to that June 30th, 2021 trigger date, which could push us into the 4th year.
And we could say, nope, we're closing it, that's proper enough notice.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
TJ?
Appreciate the effort to have something on the floor that is different. Most of the concerns that I've raised in this meeting tonight, and ones and 2 or 3 very small things I want to say now, is my, I think, final words on this tonight aren't addressed by these, so it doesn't change as far as that go. But I do want to, you know, one of the things is that when we're voting on the contract, our policy says that we must consider this, this, and this at a minimum. And so that I think that, you know, bringing things in that aren't directly before us, the 3 things listed, the president listed at the start of the meeting tonight, is not only appropriate, but in fact it's demanded by our policy if those are of concern to board members that we consider. I think that among the things that we are required to consider is staff and parent support for the school. And I think that we heard a handful of staff members who support it, some of whom have ties to the school already. And we heard from a lot of other people who have serious and grave concerns, and then we're required to consider that. We're also required to consider parents, and here's another ill-defined word because it doesn't say which parents we're supposed to hear from. We heard from parents who've had great experiences with Isthmus Montessori and other Montessori schools elsewhere, and you know, we should certainly consider those. We heard from other parents in the district who oppose this, and we heard from people who essentially said that you know, that they would come to the district if we had Montessori, but they're not otherwise. And I don't know even how to consider that message in terms of this. But other things I want to talk about, and things that are more directly, is that a couple of unanswered questions is that I'm really not clear why this school hasn't been treated as a conversion from a private school. And I know that the first iteration of the proposal was clearly a conversion. The second iteration was clearly a conversion. The third iteration is not clearly a conversion. However, the contract with IMA Inc., the draft contract, refers to a transition from a private school, and by common sense logic, this is a conversion, and a conversion requires a different process. And so you know, that's one thing that I think we need to look at. Conversion is ill-defined in state law, and to just leave that kind of there. I think the other thing that we really need to have a deeper understanding of is the 3K piece.
Is the what?
The 3K piece, the 3-year-old kindergarten piece. You know, the contracts say that MMSD does not offer 3-year-old kindergarten. Yet, this is an MMSD classroom and there is 3-year-old kindergarten in it. The contract says these are private school students. But as far as I can see, the private school responsibility starts and ends with collecting tuition and pointing them towards the classroom, almost. I don't know who collects vaccination records. I don't know if these students have to follow our behavior education plan. I don't know who is responsible for liabilities if these students hurt other students or if other students are hurt by these students. All these things are unfounded. And one of the biggest thing to me which is unfounded is that there is no, I don't even know whether these students can simply enroll for the morning or whether they have to enroll for the full day. And I asked that and I never got an answer to that. But one of the things that worries me the most is that we have no, that we're saying, okay, IMA Inc. can charge tuition to put children in what is our classroom, and there is no limitation. It doesn't say you can charge the actual cost plus 2%, you can charge the actual cost plus 4%. They can charge whatever the heck they want to put people in our classroom, and we don't have any say in that. The whole thing bothers me on principle. I don't think that tuition should be charged to be placed in our classrooms, period, except for the rare exceptions of things like students who are over 21 and all those kind of things that are in state law that we're allowed to do. If tuition is to be charged, I think that the tuition should be charged by the district. The charter school is not allowed to by state law. The district is allowed to. Having a third party charge tuition to put students in our classrooms, to me, is just I mean, it's beyond, I can't even believe that this is before us, to be honest. It is so crazy. Again, if we want to have 3K students and we want them to pay tuition, then we should be the ones charging tuition. Why bring a third party into this? I mean, I don't understand it, except for the opportunity for the third party to charge more than they're paying. Right now, they're to pay $56,000. I know they're going to be charging a heck of a lot more than $56,000 a year to the 20 students. So what we're doing is providing a surplus generating, because they're a nonprofit, a surplus generating opportunity for a private entity at the public expense. I got big problems with that. I'm going to leave it at that.
Appreciate it. Anyone else with final comments?
Final comment?
Well, this has been moved. The contract has been moved by Dean, the second by Nikki.
Okay.
So only thing left is final comments.
All right, great. I was just getting caught up in the discussion. So comments around the new language. I just wanted to be clear that it doesn't take into account the preferences that we're giving to the staff at the school as well as the governance council. Which
it doesn't modify. I heard questions raised. I actually didn't hear a recommendation or suggestion.
Okay.
So I didn't presume.
Yep. Well, I mean, if that's discretionary, I find that highly problematic. I mean, we're already guaranteeing these 7 founders seats in the school as well as all their children. I mean, I just feel like if we really want to create this option for people who aren't already accessing it, to me, why would we be filling up our seats with the founders, the children, their siblings, the governing council, who obviously, once you get to be a founder because you're deeply involved in bringing the program, which means you probably had access to it already, which is why you're involved with it to begin with. So I do have a problem with those discretionary preferences that we're putting in there. I don't think it's going to achieve the goal of what we have within our strategic framework for ourselves. In regard to the other issues, I think from the beginning, my major concern has been the inadequate staffing. I continue to believe that it's inadequate. I've looked at all the staffing in the public Montessoris in Milwaukee, and they actually do have special education assistants, they have bilingual resource specialists, they have educational assistants, they have social workers, speech and language, all these different folks in their schools. And so for us to put together a contract where this isn't going to be expected, I think is going to create additional financial burden for the school district, because those services will have to be provided. No matter what we say the average cost is, if a kid comes in with an above average cost, we're the LEA and we're on the hook to provide that in the area of special education as well as for English language learners, which we haven't talked very much about, the staffing for students that would qualify as an English language learner. And so, and I think a major concern I have that ties back to what TJ had, so when I was doing some research around Milwaukee, the one thing I found is that the only Montessori the public Montessori that was actually a conversion of a private Montessori to a public Montessori was done via a non-instrumentality. Every other Montessori was a slow grow program. And so it's frustrating, especially knowing that Melissa came from Milwaukee with this vision that they have obviously used this approach. They have many schools. So I think, and I've said this from the beginning, I feel like this would be a great option for our district. I wish we could have looked at it as a slow grow model. And I think if we do that, we would achieve the goals that we're putting forward. So that would just be my other general comment.
Okay, thank you, Nikki.
Very simply, I thank IMA for all their hard work. Unfortunately, my first issue is the staffing issue. We normally have 7 teachers. With 8, we have 1. They're 6 short. That worries me. Art, music, phys ed. I understand it's built in the curriculum. I went to Montessori for 2 years because I was kicked out of a public preschool because I couldn't walk right. I understand what a good Montessori looks like. I respect IMA, but this is not including what a good Montessori looks like. And the budget doesn't balance for any of the 5 years. I worry about that. I want our students to have the best. I want to do as much as possible. Have we not provided for students of color? Absolutely. Have we not always provided for students with disabilities? I'd be a fool to say no. But we have to think, is this the best for our students, or do they deserve more? And that's all I have to say on it.
Mary?
Yeah, I think we can look at issues. There's 2 sides to this coin. I actually think the fact that we have really, really engaged parents who have put in a lot of work and effort and want to be here as the school grows is a huge plus. I see that as being one of the differences between how Nuestro Mundo developed, where you had really, really engaged a heart, and frankly, what happened to Badger Rock afterwards. You had engaged people at the start. It was an idea, but they weren't there throughout. And in fact, it was more the district hiring the principal, not a huge amount of engagement. I think that the fact that there's already sort of a base there, even though you're talking about a lottery to select all new students, almost all new students, you're looking at staff. This to me, takes the best of actually having it already started up, and then the district being able to come in and do this. I know it wasn't the way that it was started, but it's also because of the 3+ year time frame, 4 when this happens, that has been part of our process here. So I think you can find a lot of sides of the coin here on all of these issues, those 2 sides. So I don't think it's entirely clear. But I go back to what James said. And I can't stand in his shoes. I can't stand in the shoes of a parent of color in this district. But I can empathize. And that's where my vote comes down to. And you bet I'm going to be on those demographics as much as we can possibly be. That is going to be, if I'm on this board in 3 years or whenever it is, I will not be voting to extend this. I will be voting to close it as one of our schools or as a charter school if it's not achieved. The same with the accountability. TJ, we'll know. I mean, we will know. But I also think that we did the right thing when we gave Badger Rock some extra time to get it together. They obviously stumbled, but I think we give a lot more guidance. We give a lot more expectations to Isthmus Montessori right out of the blocks. So I think we owe it to our community, particularly our community of color here in Madison, to give this a shot to learn from it, to see how we can use the best practices, and maybe they will need some tweaking. But I feel we have heard from enough of the community to say that we have got to do this.
Thank you. Well, I think everyone knows where I stand. It's all about access. It's all about 50 years of history in Madison and Dane County being the worst at providing for kids of color. I have to take the leap. And one of the things I sit around and talk about and think about a lot in this community is how, we're a community where it seems like we have a lot of people with answers. We sit around the table and we have these discussions, and people speak very confidently about know how to be successful. If we don't have A in the school, we can't be successful. If we don't have B in the school, we can't be successful. One of the things I would really appreciate before my time is up is for the people who've been working in this city in the district and the board for the last 50 years to stand up and say, you know what, I have not gotten it right. The data says and shows that we haven't gotten it right, not for kids of color. We sit around the table and say, well, I know. What we're really doing is voicing our opinion, and I can appreciate that. But everyone has a part in getting it wrong where kids of color is concerned. Everyone who's worked in this community, and I have not heard anyone stand up and say, you know what, these kids of color have been suffering, and I've been working in the district and in community groups for 20, 30 years, and I've been part of getting it wrong. I have not, to this day, in all my years, and I've probably been in this town longer than anyone here around this table, and most people, I have not heard anyone say, you know what, we've gotten it wrong. We just simply have gotten it wrong. But I always hear people say, I know how to do it right, but there's no evidence. Where's the evidence that anyone knows how to do this right? Show me. Show me a person. I've heard all of my board members, I've heard board members for the last 7 years sit around the table and say, well, you got to have this, you got to have A, you got to have B in order to get this right. But I can't find the data over the years that indicate that anyone has gotten it right. Who's gotten it right? We're last in the nation for educating kids of color. And all that's being asked here is to spend a little bit of a $400 million budget to try to get it right. To try to do a pilot, basically, that can indicate and show us that maybe there's another way that, even though on the margin, we're not talking about big numbers, but on the margin, that maybe we can find a way to bring about some success for a small group of kids of color. I hope that, as my time dwindles, that somewhere in this community, people stand up and say, you know what, we've gotten it wrong all these years. And instead of me sitting around here and all the folks talk about how, and knowing how to do it right, because that means you can show and produce some data that indicates you've gotten it right, but I haven't seen it. All the data around kids of color shows that we have not gotten it right. And so I'm here willing to vote yes on the contract because I'm willing to take the leap, even if it's a small group of kids of color that has a chance to get access, to have a chance for some successes that we have not had in this community. And so that's what's important to me, is, and the fact that we have built in the accountability framework. And the board will need to simply have the backbone to hold the school accountable, to make sure that, that if the demographics and achievement numbers are not there, that we hold them accountable. And that's why we put strong language in around the accountability. And so that's where I am. I have to take the leap because I live it. I've seen it. I can't get away from it. I can't go home and be done with it. It's cradle to grave with me. But I know as you walk out the door, you're done with it, most of you. Yeah, you can talk and phone each other and talk about budgets and all of that, but the fact of the matter is, you're through with it. You don't live it, and your kids don't have it. And so, so I understand, but this community has gotten it wrong, and I'm going to vote for at least taking a chance on this small group of kids. So, only one that have not spoken is Dean, and he's said he doesn't need to, and I can appreciate that.
Kate didn't speak.
Kate, do you?
Okay.
You're done with it? Okay. That's good. So we have a motion on the floor, and it's been moved and seconded. So we've had final comments, and so I guess then all in favor of the motion on the floor, that is to approve a 5-year contract. We'll see a show of hands, and then I'll ask you, Kate, for verbal. So all those in favor of approving the contract, show of hands, please. Okay, so we got 3 hands, and Kate, what's your vote?
I'm a nay, James.
Okay, so the contract then, the motion to approve the contract does not pass. Okay, so
Just for procedure, you should call for the nays. I'm sorry, it just.
Yeah, you didn't say the nays.
Okay, all opposed?
Nay.
Nay.
And Kate's a nay. Okay, so. All right, so we will talk about next steps at a later time. Okay, so move adjournment.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, all opposed? Meeting adjourned.